Alright, time for more Anti-Dühring. So we're going to take a look at chapter 3, which is the first chapter or section that is not an introduction. So this is called classification, period, a priorism. Philosophy, according to Dühring, is the development of the highest form of consciousness, of the world and of life, and in a wider sense, embraces the principles of all human knowledge and volition. Wherever a series of cognitions or stimuli or a group of forms of being come to be examined by human consciousness, the principles underlying these of necessity become the object of philosophy. These principles are the simple, or until now assumed to be simple, constituents or complex knowledge and volition. Constituents of complex knowledge and volition. Like the chemical composition of bodies, the general conception of things can also be reduced to basic forms and basic elements. These ultimate constituents or principles, when they have once been discovered, are valid not only for the immediately known and accessible world, but also for the world which to us is unknown and inaccessible. Philosophical principles consequentially provide the final completing link required by the sciences in order to make of them a uniform system by which nature and human life can be explained. Apart from the fundamental forms of all being, philosophy has only two special subjects for investigation: nature and the world of man. Thus, we find our material quite spontaneously arranged in three groups, namely the general scheme of the universe, the science of the principles of nature, and finally the science of mankind. This succession at the same time contains an inner logical sequence, for the formal principles which are valid for all existence take precedence, and the objective realms to which they are to be applied then follow in the degree of their subordination. So far, Dühring, and almost entirely word for word. So we shouldn't read that as Engels asserting these things, especially that sentence: philosophical principles consequentially provide the final completing link required by the sciences in order to make of them a uniform system by which nature and human life can be explained. At least as I'm reading this, that is not Engels' view. And we'll get more into that later. So yeah, for Dühring, Eugene Dühring, philosophy embraces the principles of all knowledge and volition, and philosophical, together with scientific principles, can explain nature and human life. And that's positivism in the essence. It's a optimistic attitude towards humans' ability to explain everything. And later on in this chapter, we'll problematize that notion a little bit. So yeah, for Dühring, we got sort of three categories of philosophical inquiry. There's the fundamental forms of all being, what Hegel calls the logic. And then we have these two special subjects. We have nature, which you could say is the subject of the natural sciences, and human life, you could say, is the subject of the social sciences. And philosophy helps unite those. And this is a pretty popular conception, I think, still today. What he is dealing with are therefore principles, formal principles, derived from thought, and not from the external worlds, which are to be applied to nature in the realm of man, and to which therefore nature and the realm of man have to conform. But whence does thought obtain these principles? From itself? No, for Dühring says himself, the realm of pure thought is limited to logical schemata and mathematical forms. God damn it. Every time. I need something better to hold my phone. This cord is unfortunately positioned. back up a little bit. Note, for Anti-Dühring himself says, the realm of pure thought is limited to logical schemata and mathematical forms. The latter, moreover, as we shall see, is wrong. Logical schemata can only relate to forms of thought. But what are we dealing with here? But what we are dealing with here are not only forms of being, of the external world, and these forms can never be created and derived by thought out of itself, but only from the external world. But with this, the whole relationship is inverted. The principles are not the starting point of the investigation, but its final result. They are not applied to nature and human history, but abstracted from them. It is not nature and the realm of humanity which conform to these principles, but the principles are only valid insofar as they are in conformity with nature and history. That, I think, is very important. And it's, if you're reading along, it's worth reading a second or third time to see exactly what he's saying, because it almost sounds like he's saying that's what Anti-Dühring is asserting, but no, he's kind of switching tracks mid-sentence, and that is what he's asserting. He goes on to say, that is the only materialistic conception of the matter, and Anti-Dühring's contrary conception is idealistic, makes things stand completely on their heads, and fashions the real world out of ideas, out of schemata, schemes, or categories existing somewhere before the world from eternity, just like a Hegel. So I think this paragraph is very important, and really this is the best summary of what materialism seems to mean for Engels, and I mean we can kind of break it down into 3 principles, ironically. So the first is that the principles are not the starting point of the investigation, but the final results. So we don't start with principles. We might presuppose logical principles, but well, it's going to depend on the investigation, right? We don't have to always use immanent critique, right? But I think it's an important point. The principles are not the starting point of the investigation, but its final result. I mean, we see that in Marx, at least in how he presents his findings in Capital. He goes on to problematize that a little bit in the Grundrisse, but we don't have to get into that right now. So I mean, the idea is that we start with particulars and we abstract principles from there. We don't go the other way around. And then second principle, they're not applied to nature and human history, but abstracted from them. Yeah, I just kind of said that. Those two, I think one implies the other. And then the third is one that I found pretty interesting. It is not up to nature to conform to these principles, but rather it is up to the principles to conform to reality. So we've seen that, we see that over and over again in Marx and Engels' work, but usually in regards to, visions of socialism or communism, that it's not up for the world to conform to our vision of what socialism will look like, but it's up to, our principles to hold true in reality. And if they don't, then they ought to be discarded. And that view, that is really the essence of what science is all about. We could reframe that as falsifiability, falsifiability refers to demarcation, but to the process of falsification, I should say. That our principles are only useful insofar as they conform to reality, and I mean we could go further and say that they're only useful if they, if there's even the possibility for them to conform or not conform to reality. And I mean, that is what falsifiability is about. So, I think this is, I'd say, a good piece of evidence for my view that what Engels calls materialism is really has less to do with metaphysical materialism, although he does go on to assert that in times, although I think kind of weakly, but it's really more about science. All right. In fact, let us compare Hegel's encyclopedia and all its delirious fantasies with Dühring's final and absolute truths. With Dühring, we have in the first place general world schematisms, which Hegel calls logic. Then, with both of them, we have the application of these schemata, or logical categories, to nature, the philosophy of nature, and finally their application to the realm of man, which Hegel calls the philosophy of mind, the inner logical sequences of the Dühring succession. The inner logical sequence of the Dühring succession, therefore, leads us quite spontaneously back to Hegel's encyclopedia, from which it has been taken with a loyalty which would move the wandering Jew of the Hegelian school, Professor Michelet of Berlin, to tears. Michelet of Berlin. Maybe it's not Michelet then. Or maybe he's French and he just lived in Berlin. Michelet? I don't know. So, yeah, those who do not understand Hegel are doomed to repeat it. Such a result comes of accepting a quite, Such a result comes of accepting in quite a naturalistic way consciousness, thought, as something given, something from the outset in contrast to beings and nature. If this were so, it must seem extremely remarkable that consciousness and nature, thinking and being, the laws of thought and the laws of nature should be so closely in correspondence. But if the further question is raised, what then are thought and consciousness, and whence do they come? It becomes apparent that they are not products of the human brain, and that man himself is a product of nature, which has been developed in and along with its environment. Whether it is self-evident that the products of the human brain, being in the last analysis also products of nature, do not contradict the rest of nature, but are in correspondence with it. This paragraph greatly undermines my what I would like to read out of Engels. I would like to be able to say that Engels wasn't really a materialist, because I like it when Engels agrees with me. But we should be honest and say that yeah, he did believe that consciousness is a product of the human brain. But the question asked there is, does that view correspond with what he was, what he advocates in terms of method? Does that principle, does it correspond with reality? And can we demonstrate that? And if we can't demonstrate that, what are we to do with that idea? Can we actually explain in particularities how consciousness might arise out of the human brain? Maybe we can. I don't think we can. But there's a lot of research going on in that field, and I'm open to being proven wrong there. But Dühring cannot permit himself such a simple treatment of the subject. He thinks not only in the name of humanity, in itself no small achievement, but in the name of the in the name of the conscious and reasoning beings of all or on all celestial bodies. It would be in fact a degradation of the basic forms of consciousness and knowledge to attempt to rule out, or even to put under suspicion, their sovereign validity and their unconditional claim to truth by applying the epithet of human to them. So in order that no suspicion may arise that on some celestial body or other twice... Oh, that on some celestial body or other, twice 2 make 5. 2 plus 2 equals 5, yeah. Erdoring cannot treat thought as some human characteristic, and so he has to cut it off from the only foundation to which we find, namely mankind and nature. And with that, he tumbles hopelessly into an ideology which reveals to him as the epigone of the epigon. I don't actually know that word. I just breezed past this before. Of the epigone Hegel. In passing, we may note that we shall often meet Erduring again on other celestial bodies. So, yeah, I mean, vulgar materialism is doomed to contradict itself, in a sense. That's what I got out of this. It might be worth revisiting this paragraph at some points, because I don't think I understand all of it. It goes without saying that no materialistic doctrine can be founded on such an ideological basis. Later on, we shall see that Erduring is forced more than once to endow nature surreptitiously with conscious activity. That is to say, therefore, with what in plain language is called God. So, yeah, this, endowing nature with conscious activity, that, I mean, as I'm reading this, like I said, I haven't read Dühring, because it's not available in English. But it seems like what Dühring is presenting is kind of a vulgar or naive materialistic conception. And Engels here is pointing out the ways that sort of leads him back to idealism, or panpsychism, or self-contradiction. Endowing nature surreptitiously with conscious activity. Yeah, that gets at the sort of ad hoc nature of panpsychism. Panpsychism is it's a great get out of jail free card for materialism. Whenever I'm in a conversation with somebody about emergence and consciousness, as soon as this they start to see how this this idea that we're going to explain consciousness in terms of emerging from physical processes, just having faith in that is akin to the God of the Gaps argument. It can be pushed back forever. Well, panpsychism. And I don't exactly have a rebuttal to that, other than, well, it certainly offends intuition in a way, doesn't it? But it's certainly possible that consciousness is just a property of matter. It's, it seems different from other properties of matter, at least subjectively. So it seems like a kind of way to smuggle in a form of dualism to me. Maybe not, dualism in categories of matter, but at least dualism in properties. And where does that property come from? But our philosopher of reality had also other motives for shifting the basis of all reality from the real world to the world of thought. The sciences of the general world's schematicism of these formal underlying principles of being is indeed precisely the foundation of Erduring's philosophy. If we deduce world schematism not from our minds, but only through our minds, from the real world, deducing the basic principles of being from what is, We need no philosophy for this purpose, but positive knowledge of the world and what happens in it. And what yields is also not philosophy, but positive science. In that case, however, Dühring's whole volume would be nothing but love's labors lost. I like that paragraph a lot. That's and I think it's a good it bolsters my one of my theses going into this, that Engels was not after like a new something akin to dialectical materialism. He was not trying to create like a new abstract model that we can understand all of inquiries through, but that he thought such a thing could be rendered obsolete, at least on principle, through particular sciences. And that might sound like I'm misreading that, because of course in the, he's providing this this point to point out a contradiction in Dühring, but I think if you sit with it for a moment and try to hear what I'm saying in good faith, that well, maybe I should try to explain myself better. But I'm sure I'll be talking about this more as we go on, so I'm not going to here. Further, if no philosophy as such is any longer required, then also there is no more need of any system, nor even of any natural system of philosophy. The perception that all the phenomena of nature are systematically interconnected drives science on to prove the systematic interconnection throughout, both in general and in detail. Yeah, he's kind of reasserting a Hegelian concept there of, interconnectedness between things, and the idea that if you start with any one particular inquiry and carry it to its conclusion, that will inevitably end up describing all of reality. Maybe not in practice. Hegel thought in practice. He thought he had done that, which is, if Hegel's wrong about anything, then, we're going to go on to what I think is Engels' best critique of Hegel, actually. That as I see it is kind of the, that's I've heard people call that a vulgar reading of Hegel, and it's kind of the same reading of Hegel that like Bertrand Russell outlines in The History of Western Philosophy, and Russell is pretty dismissive of it, but I don't think that Russell gets the nuance that actually makes that that actually supports that view, because Russell is looking at these things metaphysically and only looking at internal relations. And if you only look at internal relations, that doesn't make sense, because then you can take systems in isolation. Alright. But an adequate, exhaustive scientific statement of this interconnection, the formulation in thought of an exact picture of the world system in which we live, is impossible for us and will always remain impossible. If at any time in the evolution of mankind such a final conclusive system of the interconnectedness or interconnections within the world, physical as well as mental and historical, were brought to completion, this would mean that human knowledge had reached its limit. And from the moment when society had been brought into accord with that system, further historical evolutions would be cut short, which would be an absurd idea, pure nonsense. Yeah. I think that's also a great point. That the idea that we can, explain all modes of inquiry, even in the abstract, is kind of backwards. It places principles before reality, and the conclusion of that is that we can reach an endpoint in terms of human knowledge, and Hegel may have even asserted such a thing, but yeah, such an absolute understanding I don't think is within our capabilities. Not on principle though. On principle, I think it is actually, but in practice, just because the world is in a constant state of change, and there will always be new things to add to our model, and we're in practice not going to be able to keep up. So we should have some nuance there. We don't rejecting positivism in this sense doesn't mean that we need to reject the utility of logic. We can think that on principle we do have the faculties to describe reality, but that in practice such a feat is not within our capabilities. Mankind, therefore, finds itself faced with a contradiction. On the one hand, it has to gain an exhaustive knowledge of the world system and all its interrelations. And on the other hand, because of the nature both of man and of the world system, this task can never be completed or completely fulfilled. But this contradiction lies not only in the nature of the two factors, the world and man. It is also the main lever of all intellectual advance, and finds its solution continuously, day by day, in the endless progressive evolution of humanity, just as, for example, mathematical problems find their solution in an infinite series or continued fractions. Each mental image of the world system is and remains, in fact, limited, objectively through the historical stage and subjectively through the physical and mental constriction of its maker. But Dühring explains in advance that his mode of reasoning is of such a kind that it entirely excludes any tendency to a subjectively limited view of the world. We saw above that he was omnipresent on all possible celestial bodies. We see now that he is also omniscient. He has solved the ultimate problems of science and so nailed boards across the future of all knowledge. That supports what I was saying a minute ago. Done with that page. Yeah. As with the basic forms of being, so also Dühring thinks that he can produce ready-made the whole of pure mathematics a priori. That is, without making use of the experiences offered us by the external world. In pure mathematics, in his view, the mind deals with its own free creations and imaginations. The concepts of numbers and forms are its adequate object, which it can create of itself, and they have a validity which is independent of particular experience and of the real content of the world. All right, let's go over some definitions real quick in terms of mathematics. This is something I have feelings about. So, what is magic? What is mathematics? I mean, there's a lot of definitions that you can find for what it is, but kind of the most popular one, and one I think that is pretty adequate in terms of a working definition, is that math is logic applied to notions of quantity, arrangement, quantity, arrangement, position, shape, form, whatever. I mean, you can take really any number of measures. Some definitions will try to, reduce them all down to just like a list of three. But I think it's kind of an open question. See, like, new areas of mathematics are about all sorts of things. So logic is a priori, in a sense. It's, it seems to hold true whether we're talking about abstract systems or talking about reality. And we can get into where that comes from later, because we can also problematize a priorism of logic, but it's a little easier to do with mathematics, and I think has to come first. So these notions, right, of position, arrangement, quantity, what are they, right? If we assume that we have logic, that logic is a priori, then, it's tempting to say that these are, or to try to find a way that these are contained within logic. Bertrand Russell, we were talking about it earlier, his whole project, he was also a communicator and a popularizer of various concepts, but in Principia Mathematica, he makes this attempt to define mathematics, all in terms of set theory. So all in terms of, just logic. He wants to reduce mathematics to logic. And it fails. And there's some room for debate about why it fails. Some people want to pin it all on incompleteness, which I think doesn't quite get to the root of the issue, because, even if we just, incompleteness being, in reference to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? It's a very elegant proof, very complicated proof, of the idea that in any given logical system, there are going to be some statements that we, on principle, cannot find the answers to, which seems to be the case. This whole crazy system takes like prime numbers and comes up with this like sort of code for coding statements, and it's very hard to wrap your head around. But if you're looking for a fun proof, if you like proofs, if you're a nerd like me, check that one out. But I think Engels here kind of addresses why such a thing is doomed to fail. He's going to go on to address it further, and I think we should think about these things categorically. So quantity, arrangement, position, whatever. Do these come just from the minds? It's tempting to say yes, because we can, arrive at mathematical proofs that seem to hold independent of subjective experience and of matter. But if you go read Euclid's Elements, it starts with things that he posits. It presupposes logic, and then there's 5 axioms that he posits. And what does it mean to posit something? It's it's to put forward an axiom, to say that there's this thing that we're going to assume, and then we're going to reason from there. So they're postulates. And what is matter? We don't have direct access to matter. Our interactions with matter are mediated by sense experience. I look at this cup and I feel it. I see it. Taste the water that's inside. There are degrees to which I have access to it, but all of these are mediated by my senses. I do not know this cup in of itself. That is, Kant's kind of major contribution, one of his major contributions, the one that people, is almost universally accepted. There's others that are a little more controversial that I like as well, but that's the one that people don't tend to argue about. We do not have direct access to matter. So really all we can do is we can postulate it. So matter is a postulate, or a set of postulates, just like the things that math deals with. So that begs the question, is math all that different from science? Well, science certainly has a direct empirical character in the way that math doesn't. But, it's a long time that I thought that calling math a type of science was a grave sin, but I don't know. It's it doesn't operate under falsifiability, but is that because it's something categorically different, or is that because it just doesn't need to? And it depends on where we want to draw the line in terms of demarcating what is science. But I think in the view that Engels is presenting, it is a science. And as Hegel used the word science, it certainly is a science. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's see, where were we? So I mean, we can read this a couple ways, and I think there's one correct reading. So it comes across a little like Engels is denying independent mathematical truths. He's saying that we get these ideas that math deals with from reality, which rubs a lot of people the wrong way. It definitely rubbed me the wrong way when I first read this. But I read it again, and it's true. It does come from reality in a degree. At least math as a system has external relations. And this is the dialectical view, right? That we cannot just look at math in terms of independent truths. Does that mean that independent truths are not real? No, it doesn't. And the kind of, Trotsky's reading of this, I pick on Trotsky too much, but, let's say Caleb Maupin's view of this. Caleb Maupin did a video where he talks about dialectical materialism and how the foundation of that is that A does not equal A, which, no, it's not that. It's, the dialectical view is to look at external relations as well as internal relations, whereas the metaphysical view looks merely at internal relations. But we should not deny one for the other. That's vulgar. As soon as you want to just look at external relations, everything falls apart. Your worldview becomes subject to the principle of explosion. If you assume A does not equal A, everything is true. Someone framed this as you can't deny the law of non-contradiction. You can accept it, or you can both accept and reject it, which is it's exactly right. And you read the ABCs of materialist dialectics, it opens with a rejection of it, and then he goes on to presuppose it in other places. We should probably read that at some point. I have all my notes on it and stuff. I just and I've written them up and lefty pull thread on this, which, unless you're one of my two viewers who actually comes from my channel, that's probably where you'll be seeing this, so you can just scroll up in the thread. So yeah, I don't think that's what he's saying. That math just merely comes from the material world, but rather that there's a categorical similarity there. Math, the concepts we deal with in math are concepts in the real world. Quantity, this difference here between, the quantity in our heads, this perfect abstract quantity. Is it different from quantity in the real world? Maybe, if you assume that matter has some kind of, is in a different category than a priori constructs. But I think we can break that down. So yes, I mean there's a give and take there. We get these notions from the world, but there is still like an independent. There still are independent mathematical truths, and if you read that paragraph as we're throwing that out, then, well, depending on your perspective, you might be bothered by that, or happy. You might think I'm an idiot, but the first sentence of the next paragraph, he goes on to clarify. It's very nicely in a way that supports my view here. He says the pure mathematics has a validity which is independent of the particular experience of each individual. That pure mathematics has a validity which is independent of the particular experience of each individual is, for that matter, correct. And this is for all established. Jesus. All right, let's try that again. That pure mathematics has a validity which is independent of the particular experience of each individual is, for that matter, correct. And this is true of all established facts in every science, and indeed of all facts whatsoever. The magnetic poles, the fact that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. Well, stop at the end of that sentence. So yeah, I mean, he's again inserting that the internal relations of mathematics as a system are real. This is it's 2 + 2 = 5. Whether or not there's anyone to realize that, yeah, in a sense, yes. In terms of the internal relations of that system of math, yes, that is a truth. Would that ever be, actualized in any way? If, like, there's nobody there to understand it, or if we didn't, have things that we wanted to quantify in the world, no, probably not. A mind in a void is not going to come up with these things. Because, if you're just a brain in a jar, what do you have to quantify? Where do you get the notion of quantity? Can you posit it? And can you really? I don't know. I don't think so. You can posit anything you want, but where are you going to get that idea? The magnetic poles, the fact that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, the fact that Hegel is dead and that Dühring is alive, hold good independently of my own experience, or that of any other individuals, and even independently of Dühring's experience. When he begins to sleep, the sleep of the just, Jesus, even independently of Dühring's experience, when he begins to sleep, the sleep of the just. It's death, right? It's a nice euphemism. But it is not at all true that in pure mathematics the mind deals only with its own creations and imaginations. The concept of number and form have not been derived from any source other than the world of reality. Yeah, I mean that's true. That's true if you accept realism. I mean, whether you call reality matter, which I do think is a mistake, or whether you call reality something different. If you're a realist, or at least if you're a monist, then yes, these numbers have to be derived from the world of reality. And even most idealists wouldn't deny that. Because what if reality is mind at the end of the day, then yeah, I mean, then there's nothing to show there. You only have to jump through hoops in that regard if you want to say that the world is matter. The 10 fingers on which men learn to count, that is, to carry out the first arithmetical operation, may be anything else, but they are certainly not a free creation of the mind. Counting requires not only objects that can be counted, but also the ability to exclude all properties of the objects considered, other than their number. And this ability is the product of a long historical evolution based on experience. Like the idea of number, so the idea of form is derived exclusively from the external world, and does not arrive in the mind as a product of pure thought. There must be things which have shapes, and whose shapes are compared before anyone can arrive at the idea of form. Yes, this is true. Pure mathematics deals with the space, forms, and quantity relations of the real world, that is, with material which is very real indeed. Yeah. And this is not a denial of mathematical realism. At least not as I'm reading it. They're rather an assertion that these mathematical concepts are not apart from the real world. They might have, truth independent of it, but they ultimately deal with the content of the world, and are derived from the content of the world, which I think is true from a materialist, a dialectical materialist perspective. I say that somewhat facetiously here. Facetiously? No, the opposite of facetiously. What is the opposite of facetiously? Be facetious means you're taking something that is serious lightly. I'm taking something that I think should not be taken seriously. Dialectical materialism. Pretending to take it seriously. Sardonically? I don't know. Pure mathematics deals with the space, forms, and quantity relations of the real world. That is, with material which is very real indeed. Yes, good. The fact that this material appears in an extremely abstract form can only superficially conceal its origin in the external world, but in order to make it possible to investigate these forms and relations in the pure state, it is necessary to abstract them entirely from their content. To put the content aside is irrelevant, hence we get the point without dimensions, lines without breadth and thickness, A and B, and X and Y, constants and variables, that only at the very end of all these do we reach for the first time the free creations and imaginations of the mind, that is to say, imaginary magnitudes. Yeah. Again, I mean, math does deal with abstractions, and abstractions, there are truths about abstraction, statements we can make about abstractions, where those truths are true independently, but those abstractions have to be abstracted from something. They don't come first. And, I think for Engels that really is the essence of materialism. And one that I agree with. Even the apparent derivation of mathematical magnitudes from each other does not prove their a priori origin, but only their rational interconnection. Before it was possible to arrive at the idea of deducing the form of a cylinder from the rotation of a rectangle about one of its sides, a number of rectangles and cylinders, in however imperfect a form, must have been examined. That's true. And it's tempting to read more into that. And he's saying, if you've read Euclid's Elements, you say, no, that's all you need to do to uncover all of Euclidean geometry is just these 5 postulates, and then it all follows. But he's making a descriptive statement about how it actually happened here, how it must have happened. And I think that's right. We had cylinders before we had Euclid's Elements. Could we have had Euclid's Elements before cylinders? On principle, maybe. In practice, I don't know. Like all other sciences, mathematics arose out of the needs of men, from the measurement of land and of the content of vessels, from the computation of time and mechanics. But as in every department of thought at a certain stage of development, the laws abstracted from the real world become divorced from the real world, and are set over against it as something independent, as laws coming from outside to which the world has to conform. This took place in society and in the states, and in this way, and not otherwise, pure mathematics is subsequently applied to the world, although it is borrowed from the same world and only represents one section of its forms of interconnection. It is only just precisely because of this that it can be applied at all. Yeah, it's getting into the relationship between a priori and could say a posteriori, but really material constructs. It does not just go one way. We derive these a priori truths, which they are still a priori truths, but we derive them from the world. We do not derive them from pure thought. And that's just a descriptive statement, which I think is true. I don't know. Like, you can come up with a thought experiment. You can point to Hegel's logic. You take it pretty much on face value. If you think that the way that Hegel actually wrote the science of logic is he, just sat down and wrote it. See, I said I was gonna avoid talking about the Grundrisse, but let's avoid talking about this in the context of Hegel. Let's talk about this in the context of Marx. So Marx presents his inquiry in Capital in this very strict dialectical form, where he starts from these very abstract postulates, and from there he slowly develops his theory, and it's not even until volume 3 that we even get to anything that actually describes capitalism as it exists. And this is the same sort of method that Hegel uses in the science of logic, right? He starts with being, and looks at what that implies, just the notion of being. Marx starts with the commodity, and Hegel says, being, Well, he looks at content and form of being, and being implies nothing, and in the relationship between being and nothing we find becoming, and etc., etc. And we can't know exactly if that's actually how Hegel arrived at this logical progression. We know that he thought it was a strict logic in the sense that, it could be reproduced independently. We're, I think, yet to see if that's true or not. Uh, Maybe not. Maybe someone's reproduced the science of logic independently. Be fun to see. So we need to find someone who's never read the science of logic and have them sit down, tell them to, don't think about any sort of models, and just start with pure being and just write down, all of the things that pure being necessarily implies, and see if that uncovers, everything up until the material world. I wonder. But in the Grundrisse, Marx all but admits that, or does admit, that the way that he arrived at this method is he did not start from the commodity. He actually used a method that is a lot more like Ricardo and Smith. It's very romantic and nice to think that he started from the commodity and cooked up everything in his head, but no, he started from the same, not abstract, but statistical categories that Smith and Ricardo were using, which, deflates a lot of the romanticism that we might want to look at Marx with. But does that mean that dialectics is nonsense? I don't think so. Some people read that and see, dialectics is bullshit. He was just conforming to the social pressures at the University of Berlin, and he wanted to make Hegel happy, which you read Critique of the Philosophy of Right. He was not concerned with making Hegel happy. At least at the time he wrote Capital. Obviously this was much later on in his career. I don't think he was even at the University of Berlin at this time. No, he just, there's a certain elegance to that mode of presentation that you can only really appreciate if you've studied Hegel to a degree, or maybe not. I don't know. There's something very naive about that kind of logic. Naive in a good sense, not vulgar. Childlike. It's kind of it's untainted, and I like the way that he presented Capital. But what was I talking about? What did this relate to? Man, went off on a tangent about the Grundrisse and the Grundrisse is fucking long. It's not like it was never meant to be a work that was published, on its own. It's literally just all his notes and shit from when he was writing Capital that got shoved into a book. So please don't ask me for a citation on that. I at some point will go through and take notes on it. But I'll do it with Capital first, I think. And it's gonna be a while before I get to that. It's been a while since I've read Capital. What were we talking about? This took place in society and the state, and not otherwise. Pure mathematics is subsequently applied to the world. Right, okay. So we're talking about the kind of the relationship between principles and the world. And it seems, when you read Capital, like Marx started with principles. This is what I really don't get about, like, Marxists who insist on, like, this vulgar conception of materialism. How can you read Capital and, like, think that's what Marx was doing? Like, that he, think he, like, went to some market and, like, it's like, oh yeah, that wool and that. No, he's not describing stuff in the world. He's starting from a point of abstraction, and, like, very severe abstraction. But is that actually how we, like, develop these ideas? No. These principles are, that's what we arrive at. So he presents it backwards, in a sense, which has its advantages. It's very elegant. But yeah, that's not how we arrive at ideas. We don't start with principles. We might start with logical principles. And given what we're inquiring about, we might start with, like, a mode of thought which carries certain principles. But, if you want to make an inquiry about any given thing, you cannot start with abstract principles about that thing itself. You start with the particularities, and you abstract the principles from there. And it's only because those principles were abstracted from that thing that you can ever end up applying those principles in a meaningful way. Alright. But just as Dühring imagines that, out of the axioms of mathematics, which, moreover, in accordance with the pure logical concepts, neither require nor are capable of proof, he can deduce the whole of pure mathematics without any kind of empirical ingredients whatsoever, and then apply it to the worlds so he likewise imagines that he can produce out of his head in the first place. The basic forms of being, the simple elements of all knowledge, the axioms of philosophy. Then that he can deduce from these the whole of philosophy, or world schematism. And then by sovereign decree impose this conception of his on nature and humanity. Unfortunately, nature is not at all, and the humanity only to an infinitesimal degree, composed of the Prussia of Manteuffel of 1850. Clever boy. It's like a dad joke. It's a dad joke. It's like an internet edgelord joke. It's not edgy. It's dialectical, I guess. Dühring thinks he's big brain. He thinks that he can know everything. Can't know everything about nature and humanity because you're not all of nature and humanity. I mean, I think it does get to something deeper. In a sense, I think about the problems of, like, general artificial intelligence, and this question, like, can we build a computer that, this is another way to get at the question of positivism, right? Can we build a computer that can calculate everything about the material world, that can predict the position of any given particle at any point in time in the future? And there's, like, a couple answers to that you might give. We could draw a little, like, 4x4 chart, right? There's some of those who say, like, no, in practice we cannot. And practice principles both start with PR. That's annoying. Let's do A and I. Practice principles. Yes and no. Do a little 2x2 grid here. You could say that no. On principle, you cannot. And in practice, you cannot. It's kind of the subjectivist conception of this. And that's, or vulgar materialist conception of this, I guess. At least, well, it's hard to know what follows from A does not equal A, but I shouldn't reduce vulgar materialism to that, because there's all sorts of claims that you can make that are materialist in a vulgar sense, that, well, by the principle of explosion, they can all be reduced to A does not equal A, but but that lacks a bit of utility for talking about this. So you can say on principle that like, no, this computer cannot be built. There's just things about the universe that are incalculable. And that you could cite incompleteness as justification for that. And I think you can do that while still being kind of within the bounds of well, I mean, I would cite incompleteness as an example of that, but there's more to talk about, I think. Because like maybe this computer can tell us that certain things are going to be incalculable, but it could at least make some other set of predictions. Or if you've studied nonlinear dynamics, you know that there's like some systems that are just so complex that we can't like come to these exact like answers to certain problems, but we can still like make certain statements about these systems. So maybe the universe is a little bit like that, right? And the question is really, can we build like a model? Can we build a mathematical or a logical model of everything in the world? And beyond these notions of incompleteness and complexity and chaos, you could also say that no, just the world is unknowable, even in a deeper sense. It's maybe you'd even say that it's incomplete on an ontological level, which, that might be right. Certainly interesting. Might be a bit of a cop-out. But I think what Engels is putting forward here is that, at least implicitly, this is kind of my view, that, yeah, on principle you can. At least, you could at least build a machine that could complete model of the universe in a sense. But the issue is that you would need a computer that was bigger than the universe itself. All of the universe would be inside of that computer, because you would need something to represent every particle, and you're gonna run out of particles. So it depends on which principle we're talking about, I guess. So maybe that's a way of saying on principle you can't. But yeah, I mean, Engels here is saying that, yeah, of course, no, it's impossible that Dühring would even have like the means to deduce everything about everything, because he is not everything. He is not omnipresent. He cannot say everything about nature and humanity, because nature is not at all Dühring or the people living in Prussia in 1850. And humanity is only in a very small part that. So he is limited in terms of what he can speak to. Alright, mathematical axioms are expressions of the most trivial thought content, which mathematics is obliged to borrow from logic. They can be reduced to two. The whole is greater than the part. This statement is pure tautology. As the quantitatively conceived idea part is of itself definitely related to the idea whole. And in fact, in such a way that part states without further ceremony that the quantitative whole consists of several quantitative parts. In stating this expressly, the so-called axiom does not take us a step further. This tautology can, even in a way, be proved by saying, a whole is that which consists of many parts. A part is that which consists of many whole, or which a part is that of which many make a whole. Therefore, the part is less than the whole, in which the futility of repetition brings out even more clearly its emptiness of content. Yes, it is empty of content. And that's the thing with tautologies. If you start from tautologies, the only things that you can reason from there are more tautologies. This is pretty fundamental to how logic works. I mean, yeah, try it out. Like, come up with some tautologies, things that are true self-evidently, and try to see what you can derive just using logic from that. I was having a conversation with a anarchist at one point who, was putting forward the idea that, if you have to posit any axioms, then your system is incomplete. Those should be removed over time, which is an interesting idea. But what does that mean to remove an axiom? It means that something in your inquiry, you've arrived at some conclusion that is going to support your axiom. So this whole structure then is circular, which it's explosive in its own way. Reminds me of Jordan Peterson a little bit. The truth is the good, and the good is the truth. So yeah, I mean, tautologies, what he's getting at here, right, is that, it's funny, because, I wish Bertrand Russell had read this. He would have seen a pretty good argument for why his whole career was doomed to fail. We can't just start with a priori concepts. We have to be able to posit something, and no, we're not going to be able to reduce it all to logic, because what do we use logic on, you start with tautologies, you get more tautologies. You can't say anything of meaningful content, what you can derive from a tautology. So 2, if two magnitudes are equal to a third, then they are equal to one another. This statement, as Hegel has already shown, is a conclusion, the correctness of which is guaranteed by logic, and which is therefore proved, although outside of pure mathematics. The remaining axioms relating to equality and inequality are merely logical extensions of this conclusion. So yeah, I mean, that's the idea, right, of A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And Engels is asserting that that's true here, saying that it's demonstrated by Hegel, and it holds true. If you want further evidence that A does not equal A, I keep bringing this up. I think before I do the next section, I'm gonna go over Stalin's thing on dialectical materialism, materialist dialectics, historical and dialectical materialism. I think that's what it's about. Because I hate to say this, because I know a lot of people that be a little offended by it, but it's actually a stronger, at least logically, it's a much stronger conception of materialist dialectics or dialectical materialism than what Trotsky puts forward in his little thing. And I think it's really a shame that Trotsky's has caught on to this degree, and has contributed to this divide between Marxists and the rest of, like, I don't know. I mean, we should want there to be a little bit of a divide between working class intellectuals and academia, because that is not our institution, just on a practical level. And trying to work within that institution, I think, carries some problems. We, can see this. We can look at case studies of, people that went into these institutions thinking they were going to, like, agitate from the inside and push it to the left, and they were dragged to the right. Noam Chomsky is a great example. Ended up, like, doing work for the fucking Air Force. The CIA? Yeah, I think the CIA too. Inadvertently. I think there's some interesting stories of him, like, refusing to go through certain parts of the screening, so he'd have to be, like, accompanied around inside of the facility, but, like, he was still, like, training students who were literally doing work for the Air Force. I mean, what's going to happen when you go work at MIT? I think it was the Air Force. It was like the intelligence arm of the Air Force. Or maybe it just was the CIA. It was some very classified thing. It's an interesting story, though. But yeah, I don't want to keep bringing up A does not equal A, because it's a weak conception of what dialectical materialism is, and since my aim in this theory is to kind of undermine the validity of dialectical materialism, I don't want to just keep harping on that one point, even though it does deserve to be harped on. And what I was saying before in terms of, like, the divide between Marxism and academia, that divide's not exactly bad, but the divide between Marxism and the sciences, that is a little more bad. Marxism, we have some catching up to do in terms of, like, being a science. Most sciences are using computer models to predictions, and I don't know. I mean, Anwar Shaikh is doing some good things there, I guess, and Cockshot and whatever, but there's some problems with that we can get into at a different time. So yeah, saying that A does not equal A is just a really good way to not be taken seriously by anyone with a mathematics background. It's reason that I always, like, give funny looks to people that would talk about dialectics in Trotskyist settings. And I mean, I guess the reason I harp on this so much is also because I am more connected to trot groups than I am to any ML orgs. But yeah, I'd like to say we've put A does not equal A to bed and try to address a stronger conception of what dialectical materialism is about, which be Stalin's, I think, is the next one we're going to go to. Mao's is very convoluted. That's kind of my favorite. And then I know there's someone else that Engels actually worked with. It's a Slavic-sounding name. Actually, I know exactly what book it's in that I have here, but I don't want to waste time with that, so let's just keep going. The meager principles could not cut much ice, either in mathematics or anywhere else, in order to get any further. We are obligated to import real relations in space forms, which are taken from real bodies. The ideas of lines, planes, angles, polygons, cubes, spheres, etc. are all taken from reality. And it requires a pretty good portion of naive ideology to believe that the mathematicians, that the first line came into existence through the movement of a point in space, and the first plane through the movement of a line, the first solid through the movement of a plane, and so on. Yeah, I don't think even Plato would really disagree with this. That might be a controversial take. And I mean, I'm not a Platonist, but when Plato talks about, like, his ideal forms, I don't think he was saying that in practice, well, let's leave that for another time. The first line came to, even language rebels against such a conception. A mathematical figure of 3 dimensions is called a solid body, corpus solidum, hence even in Latin a tangible object. Clever. Is therefore has a name derived from sturdy reality, and by no means from the free imagination of the mind. Yep. But why all this prolixity? After Anti-Dühring on pages 42 and 43 has enthusiastically sung the independence of pure mathematics from the world of experience, its a priorism, its preoccupation with its own free creations and imaginations of the mind, he says on page 63, it is of course easy to overlook that these mathematical elements, number, magnitude, time, space, and geometric progression, are ideal only in their form. Absolute magnitudes are therefore something completely empirical, no matter to what species they belong. But mathematical conceptions are capable of definitions, which is adequate even though divorced from actual experience. This last sentence is more or less true of every abstraction, but does not by any means prove that it is not an abstraction from reality. During his world schematicism, pure mathematics arose out of pure thought. In his philosophy of nature, it is something completely empirical, taken from the external world and then divorced from it. Which are we to believe? There we go. So that's the end of that section. Call that good, I guess. It's getting late. Go sleep. Hope y'all are doing well. Fucking leftism today. Did a good job today on Vaush's show. It kept his cool really well. I was impressed by that for sure. Check that out on LT's channel. That needed to happen. I hope he gets some exposure from it. And seeing the way that, like, Vaush reacted when LT didn't want to, talk about how evil Stalin is. So very evil. He just lost his shit. And it could have very easily devolved into a shouting match, but it's good from an optics perspective to have Vaush be the one freaking the fuck out. So, good job.